palatability is important because one, we want to be able to see our dog or our cat be enthused when they go to that bowl. It gives us a sense of being a good pet parent. We want to see our pets happy. There's instances in the case of, say, a puppy or even maybe a senior dog where they have specific nutrient requirements, and the only place they're going to get those requirements are from their food. And so it's very important that they meet their daily caloric requirements, and palatability can fit into that because obviously if the food isn't good, the dog or the cat might not consume what they need to for the day.
Welcome to our Pet Food Science Podcast. We have I have the pleasure of being with Dr. Senne today, who is an expert on palatability and pet food science, which is a whole science of itself. And I want to learn more about that, and we'll chat about how this is done and maybe why one might want to do it. Dr. Senne, if you would, could you just tell us your background and tell us how you got interested in this?
Sure, and thank you for having me today. My background is I grew up on a small farm in Kansas. I went to Kansas State and then Oklahoma State and ended up with a degree in animal nutrition. Swine nutrition specifically is what I worked on in graduate school. However, my second job out of school was as a formulator for Nestle Purina in St. Louis. And so that's how I got my start in the pet food industry. And that was about 20 years ago. And I've had a few different positions over that time with a few different companies, and been with Kemin for about almost 7 years now and working exclusively with palatants, setting up palatability trials for customers, both dog and cat. And so I had somewhat of a knowledge of palatants before I got to Kemin, being a formulator. But since I've been at Kemin, I have been, again, working exclusively with dog and cat palatants.
Leading pet food manufacturers, renderers, and ingredient suppliers recognize that Kemin is assurance. Every day they deliver specialized expertise, innovative products, and unrivaled support through the pet food and rendering value chain. From oxidation control and food safety to palatability and nutrition, all the way through a suite of tailored services that allow you to feel supported from start to finish to ensure you're getting the most from Kemin ingredients. That's why every step of the way, Kemin Nutrissurance is your partner in pet food and rendering ingredients.
Well, that's fascinating. In fact, we may have overlapped a little bit, although I think I left Purina before you arrived. So a lot of nutritionists track through that space. I wonder if you could tell us about palatants. You know, what interests you and what value do you think palatants have to the pet?
Well, to the pet, it's important. Palatability is important because one, we want to be able to see our dog or our cat be enthused when they go to that bowl. It gives us a sense of being a good pet parent. We want to see our pets happy. There's instances in the case of, say, a puppy or even maybe a senior dog where they have specific nutrient requirements, and the only place they're going to get those requirements are from their food. And so it's very important that they meet their daily caloric requirements, and palatability can fit into that because obviously if the food isn't good, the dog or the cat might not consume what they need to for the day. In addition to, as I alluded to earlier, you just want to have that pet parent get the feeling of satisfaction that they're providing for their pet. And I think we have all had that experience where you put the food down, the dog or the cat rushes to the bowl, and it gives us that feeling of we're making our pet happy, which makes us happy, and we're taking care of them.
Yeah, in fact, as a nutritionist, we would often say that, the nutrients aren't any valuable unless they're consumed. And of course, in many cases, we're working through, actually enhancing pets to eat because they may not be consuming, they're ill or they're coming from a recovery. So that has great value too. I wonder if you could talk to us about, maybe some of the ways you measure this. I mean, we have the happiness factor, but it's sort of
Mhm.
hard to improve a palatant just because the dog's really happy. How do you know which ones they really like?
Well, there's a couple of different tests that we do that are pretty well recognized in the pet food industry. The most common is what we refer to as a two bowl or a versus
Okay.
test. And this is just what the name would imply. A dog or a cat is given a choice, a ration A and a ration B, and then there is a technician at one of these professional kennels that will observe the animal and record which bowl or which ration they approach first, which one they eat first, and then at the end of the meal, we'll weigh back each bowl of food to determine which one they consumed more of. And that's how we determine how if one food is equal, better, or worse compared to another food. And so a lot of producers, pet food manufacturers will do this when they're want to make sure they're on par with their competition.
I see. So you could say, maybe a claim might be, well, my pet food tastes better than your pet food, but from a developing standpoint, like you mentioned a couple things that I think are interesting. You said first approach, which really has nothing to do with the taste of the food,
Correct.
and then the sort of total consumed, which is probably the best indicator of, I don't know about best, but it's a indicator you could put a statistics to about, is this food statistically better? Can you kind of talk about that first approach versus maybe food consumed?
Sure. So typically, if a food is better than another food because of whatever reason, the palatant or it's just better, that first approach will generally be in the same trend throughout that dog or that cat panel as the intake ratio or the consumption ratio. When you see a difference between first approach and consumption, that could indicate that there's an aroma difference. And we more often see that with dogs. As you can imagine, dogs are led through the world with their nose. You
Yeah.
can to some degree with cats, but if we see a wildly different result in first approach versus, let's say, intake or consumption, then we can pretty much infer that there's an aroma interaction going on there because it smells good, but it didn't maybe taste good, and that would be the discrepancy. But if it
Mhm.
smells good, tastes good, those two parameters generally follow each other.
Yeah, well, that's great, and it's interesting. You mentioned dogs; they really smell a lot, don't they? Maybe a lot more than we do. Can you talk about that as far as it relates to attraction to food?
They do, and when we're developing palatants, you'll hear the term Maillard reaction a lot, and
Okay.
that is how these aromatic compounds and aromas are generated is through that Maillard reaction of that free amino acid and that reducing sugar. So that's a very big part of how we develop palatants for both dog and cats is manipulating those reactions to get those meaty type of aromas, uh, so forth, for each dog and cat.
That's interesting. I've wondered, worked with sometimes in the past different methods for trying to establish a preference, but let's dive a little further into this two pan test because that's
Mhm.
really the industry standard, isn't it?
It
That's
is.
what people recognize, and it's sort of intuitive that if a pet eats more of one food than another, it likes it better. We can't ask the pet, but can you talk a little bit about the statistics? And that might be just for the nerds among us, but it's actually a fairly robust analysis, and I'd like to try and communicate that it's
Sure.
not just a feeling or something. You actually can know which one was preferred. I wonder if you could talk to us about that.
Sure. So a typical two bowl test will consist of 20 animals fed over 2 days. So that gives you 40 observations, and that's kind of the minimum you need to be able to make a statistical analysis and determine statistically, with a good 95% confidence interval, or that one food is better than the other. Now, again, you can strengthen that by feeding more than 2 days or more than 20 animals. But 20 animals, 2 days is kind of the industry standard as far as starting out with evaluating palatability. There's also repeating that, so you have more repetitions within or of that specific test.
Yeah.
But there is another test it's also fairly common where we just feed one diet.
Okay.
And while you can't compare statistically one diet to another, it's a little bit better in mimicking what the consumer is going to see in their house. And we
Yeah.
call that an acceptance test or a monadic test. And that's just more of an indication of will the dog or the cat actually accept the food? Will he refuse it? Will they consume enough to meet their caloric requirements? So that's that second type of test. I know I deviated from the statistical answer, but that's the other kind of test that we typically see run at these same kennels that we use.
Well, it's sort of fascinating for me because, my history in pet food science is long. And when we first came in, we cared about that monadic test most because we sort of said, hey, pets are going to eat what their pet parent gives them. And if they eat it well enough to maintain body weight, we're happy, give them the best nutrition possible. And then we sort of moved on from that to realize, well, maybe there's more to what taste is than just they eat enough to survive, which is kind of the monadic.
You see that monadic or that one bowl test a lot when producers are changing formulas and they just want to kind of mitigate the risk and make sure they're not making a big mistake.
Yeah.
So if you're going to change a color or a shape or a slight protein in your formula, it's more of a check before you go to market. That's mostly what those monadic tests are used for.
One of the things I just want to dive a little back to the 2-pan test because it's actually, again, it's so well accepted that if I wanted to go out and say my food is, better than my old food, I could defend that with the 2-pan test, a court of law or in the consumer's hand. We would absolutely expect it to taste better than the old one used to. Is that right?
It is right, but you have to keep in mind that these foods are constantly changing. People are switching up palatants. Producers are changing the amount of palatants. So it's important to monitor that over time. I can run a series of tests of product A versus product B and statistically say with confidence product A is better, but that might not be true 6 months from now or a year from now. Yeah,
no, that makes sense. So, I've certainly had foods in the marketplace where we improved the PAL as the food went on. But, it's just part of what people do, and it's a good thing, and pets enjoy it very much. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the difference between dogs and cats and what they like. We always used to smile at each other and sort of say, cats are not small dogs. And I sort of assume that's true in palatants, but I don't really know that. What's the difference there?
Sure. Well, cats are definitely more finicky. It's a lot, I wouldn't say a lot, but it is more difficult to pick up a statistical difference between rations or foods in cats compared to dogs. Anybody who owns a dog and a cat knows cats are very picky. They tend to go to the bowl several times a day, eat a kibble or two, walk away, come back, versus a dog who generally goes to the bowl and consumes everything fairly quickly. And again, dogs are more aroma driven, but there's a couple of other things that are kind of unique between dogs and cats and how they perceive flavors. One would be sugars and salts. Dogs are a lot like humans. We like sugar. We like things that are sweet. We like things that are salty. Cats, on the other hand, don't have those type of receptors. They don't pick up, they don't react the same way to sugar and salt the way a dog will. So that's one, difference that can go into developing a palatant. The other one is the use of phosphates. There's a few different phosphates out there, but it's pretty well known that phosphates are a very high driver of palatability for cats. And you will see phosphates in just about every type of cat palatant out there.
Yeah, some of them are, I know there's patents on, sodium acid pyrophosphate and others, and maybe the patents are expired by now, but they're very tasty pats. When I taste them, I get a sort of Diet Mountain Dew taste. It's a kind of, it's not a negative taste, but it's not so positive, but cats really like it apparently.
Cats really like it. I've heard the theory that it triggers their brain to think they're eating meat because there's a lot of phosphates in blood and in meat, so it gives them that sensation. Of course, we can't ask the cat, but we know just from testing over and over again that that is a very powerful driver of palatability for
Yeah.
cats.
Now, when you're developing a palatant and you sort of think about the whole package, do you kind of just, what do you provide? Say I was going to build a pet food and I wanted to buy your palatant for dogs and cats. And what would you provide a manufacturer to say, okay, this is what you ought to know from the nutritional side for that palatability? What, because in the end, we want a complete, we're going to feed a complete food, not the icing on the cake, if you will, or whatever
Right.
that palatant might be.
Generally, foods are formulated to be complete and balanced regardless of the palatant, and that gives you flexibility to switch palatants to not be so worried about the protein or the fat content of the palatant. However, yes, there is a certain amount of protein, fat, ash, all of those things that come in through the palatant. Um, It just depends on the starting materials, of course, and what you
Sure.
use to mix with it. In the case of a dry palatant, you can use, let's say, a yeast carrier, which is a very high protein type of a carrier, as opposed to, let's say, a cornstarch, which would be very low protein. So there is always going to be a nutrient factor to consider,
Yeah.
but usually it's just taste, revolves around the taste and the overall
Sure.
impact to the diet when we're talking about palatants.
So in some ways, you're providing to the manufacturer and again to the pet a nutrient package, but what you're really delivering is a taste component. And so
Right.
you could make a very, I always sort of smile. I think, I'm not the best baker in the world, but I know you can put all the ingredients together and make a great tasting cake or a bad tasting cake. And so it's more than just ingredients, but in the end, this is the driver, a lot of driver for a taste.
It
Is
is,
that?
and you have to keep in mind that these palatants are going over a wide variety of food matrices.
Oh,
Whether
that's
it's
interesting. Well, would you? Well, I was going to ask you because it just blew up in my mind. Then, would you have a different palatant? Say I have a food that's designed for weight maintenance, so it's kind of high fiber, low fat, versus a food for a very active pet, which might be fairly moderate fiber and enhanced fat. Would that be a different palatant then?
That's one of the tricky things is when you test palatants. Let's say we're testing a liquid dog palatant on a chicken and rice diet. Well, things are great. We're getting the response we want. And then we test it on a beef and rice or a salmon and rice. All of a sudden, the response is different.
Yeah.
Well, is there an interaction going on there between the palatant, maybe the proteins in the palatant versus the proteins in the kibble? You can have a chicken-based palatant going on a beef kibble. You could have a pork-based palatant going on a chicken kibble. There seems to be some indication that kind of mixing flavors like that tends to have more of a positive impact compared to just having a chicken-based palatant on a chicken-based kibble. But again, there's so many things that can affect palatability besides the palatant itself. It's very important to keep in mind that a correct processing, good ingredients, those things always affect palatability as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Processing parameters are very key. We know, for example, moisture is dogs prefer. They tend to like a higher moisture kibble compared to a really dry kibble, for
What
example.
about cats? Cats are so finicky. Are they like dogs in that way or different?
Cats tend to like a dry texture. You'll
Yeah.
see in the industry most cat food makers will use a dry palatant. Most
Yeah.
dog food kibble makers will use a liquid palatant, and that some of that is revolves around plant capabilities, but a lot of it revolves around the fact that it's known that cats like a dry, crunchy type texture. So that's why you would use a dry powder type palatant.
Hmm. Well, when you're working through this, have you ever thought about, like, yeah, I'm thinking aloud, if you allow it, on these different kinds of foods that have different kinds of palatants, and we want our pets to eat and enjoy their pet food, but say for example, I'm working on a weight reduction pet food. It might taste really good, but the food itself might be less consumed because it has high fiber or it has some factors in it. I mean, have you ever thought about maybe working on a system where maybe the pet had to, like I remember reading, I've never done it, but sort of like had a dog press a bar to get food back and kind of have a work for a component rather than a choice, because it might work for food that would be a little different than I choose to eat it. Do you know what I mean? Have you ever thought about that kind of measurement of desire to eat rather than sort of actual consumption?
I mean, there is some tests out there, some treat tests that are similar to what you just described, where you put
Yeah,
a treat inside of an apparatus, and then the dog has to work to get to it, and then
yeah,
that kind of a response can be measured. Um, but as far as just your weight management example on regular old kibble, I mean that would be interesting. But I think most people just compensate for that by upping the
yeah,
dosage rate
yeah. Put a
of their
little more
palatable,
in.
whatever it is.
Yeah. Not a bad idea, right? You want them to enjoy the
Right,
food even though they're only getting, maybe a
right.
food that
Because
looks
not
more like vegetables and less like prime steak and potato.
yeah, and not that. I mean, not a I would say a hugely significant calorie component is coming to the diet from the
Of course.
palatants, because we're talking about 1 or 2%. So
Yeah.
you can up that application rate in the case, because a lot of times palatants are used to mask unfavorable flavors. We see that a lot with nutraceutical type treats. You got
Yeah.
to get the dog or the cat to eat this thing, and it's not very flavorful. So they'll use a high amount of palatant either on the outside or the inside of this treat.
Mhm. No, that kind of makes sense. Yeah, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the ingredient stream that you all use. You mentioned yeast, and I understand that yeast can have sometimes some palatability all of its own, right? They can put a cheese flavor in or some of those things. Is that
Yeah,
something we'll watch?
yeast is very common in the palatability world. One is very plentiful. There's both distillers and brewers. You can use that either a small amount, let's say, in the cook process to generate some flavors, but more often it's used as a carrier. So it's mixed with those very concentrated bases that would say come out of the spray dryer. You have to mix that with something so that it flows, so that it's able to be coated on kibble or treats. And that's where we see a lot of yeast being used. We see a lot of distillers yeast. It's plentiful. A lot of cat palatants will use brewer's yeast.
Hmm.
It's kind of, I guess, in the literature, at least for a long time, it was thought that brewer's yeast is better, palatable, more palatable than distiller's yeast. But we found it's more of a supplier thing. You can still have great performing distiller's yeast. You can have bad performing distiller's yeast. I've got a slide that I present when I go to customers of an 80-20 loss to a 90-10 win just by changing out the yeast
Yeah.
vendor or supply. So there's all kinds of things to consider, especially when it comes to an ingredient like yeast.
I love that thought. I think that's something that many people sort of know intuitively, but don't think about with pet food is that ingredients that have the exact same name can have tremendously different quality and like you said, a taste component, which is in your space an absolute measure of quality, and yet
Yeah.
everyone would recognize it's appropriately sold with the same name. So
Right. If you
it's
think
hard.
about how yeast is generated, it's got its own process, just like a
Yeah.
palate. You could have different time and temperature parameters within that yeast processing thing you can get burnt yeast, you can get yeast that wasn't maybe fermented. There's all kinds of different scenarios you could
Sure.
come up with just to
Sure.
illustrate that there is differences.
Sure, it's fascinating. Well, what do you think about when you're out with a customer and you're saying here you ought to think about this palate and we've talked a little bit about quality, we've talked about taste preference, which is the reason they're buying it. Do you think of any other things? What's your space? What's the
Yeah.
wheelhouse you live in there?
It really it's fascinating because usually when you're talking to a customer about the wide variety of palatants we offer, it comes down to labeling requirements. There's
Okay.
so many different claims out there, whether it's natural, just the word natural itself can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So we have natural flavor versus AFCO natural, where every little component, even the processing aids, have to be quote unquote natural.
Hmm.
You have things like grain free, identity preserved. Uh, a few years ago, no ingredients from China was a big thing. We don't see that so much anymore. But it usually comes down to when trying to whittle down the options for a pet food producer from a choice of 30 some palatants down to one or two, comes down to how are you going to label it? What are your claims? Is grain free okay? Is pork okay? Is fish okay as an ingredient? Things like that.
So they're trying to complement what their message is to the consumer, who I assume is mostly watching this episode. They're trying to complement that claim, that position with
Mm-hmm.
the Palatine. You said something that's sort of interesting to me. I think might be interesting to those listening. Is this idea of natural? We sort of progressed with natural. Through, at one time it was kind of anything was natural that you proclaim natural, and now, like you said, there's really a very defined. AFCO is this Association of American Feed Control Officials that sort of act as a regulatory group. They it's more complicated than it sounds, but it is that. So when you're looking at natural, and you want to maybe meet that stringent AFCO definition, tell us how that works through to the actual final product for the pet food manufacturer.
Yeah. So when you see the term natural flavor on a label, that is just the component. The way I understand it, I'm not in regulatory, but that's just the ingredients that undergo the hydrolysis and that cook process. That's the flavor component, and you usually are talking about things like liver, viscera, what have you, and that's that natural flavor component. But then you can have things like mold inhibitors added after the fact that aren't so natural, yet it can still be labeled as natural flavor.
I
So it
see.
can get very confusing. But when we talk about strict all natural, or again, AFCO natural, where everything has to be natural, that's where the challenges come into making these palatants. Because I mentioned a mold inhibitor. All of for a liquid palatant, for example, those are always reduced down to a pH of around 3. And that's going to inhibit a certain amount of mold and certainly microbial growth. However, sometimes these palatants are going to sit for a while, a couple of
Mhm.
3 months, for example, and you have to be able to ensure that absolutely nothing's going to grow in that. And a good example in the AFCO natural example I'm trying to lay out is potassium sorbate. It's in a lot of foods. Humans
Yeah,
consume it. It's in a
a
very
lot of
small
breads.
amount. Typically considered a processing aid. So, in the traditional regulatory world of both human food and uh, animal food, you don't necessarily have to. You can use that and still be natural.
Right.
AFCO natural, you can't. So we have to use different technologies for mold inhibition, let's say.
Mhm.
And we use a vinegar and a citric acid type of a technology, for example, at Chemin to get around that. Not to get around that, but to be able to preserve something, a mold inhibitor that's natural.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I overspoke you, but it's interesting to me. You want to preserve the ingredient that you're providing. You want it to be healthy when used, and of course that like any ingredient has a shelf life desired. I just wonder if you can help me understand, because I'm just ignorant of this. Why is sorbate not natural, but citrate is natural? Is it the process or?
Good question. It is very confusing to me as well. I know there probably are oftentimes, another example would be phosphoric acid. That's the common acidifier and stabilizer.
Yeah.
There are natural sources of phosphoric acid, and probably a natural, meaning from the earth, source of sorbic acid, but those are often way too cost prohibitive to
I see.
actually use
I
on a
see.
big scale. So you have to come up with alternatives. The way
Yeah.
I understand it, citric can be either way, depending on how it's made, where it
Yeah.
comes from, if it's fermented or if it's comes from
Yeah.
oranges. So
No, no, that makes I actually understand that, right? So it's not the compound necessarily, but the process
right.
that made it. And of course, as a nutritionist, I want healthy pets, right? You want the very best for pets, and yet a foundational nutritional principle is that an amino acid is an amino acid is an amino acid. So if it's from a plant or from a test tube or from an animal, it's an amino acid. That's what the pet
Hmm.
cares about. But many consumers and it's important to meet that need. And I'm not denigrating the person who wants all natural. We want to provide that. That's fine. I'm still basically most interested in what benefits the pet, and of course
Hmm.
PAL is a part of that. And I when my pets eat it, I like to watch them enjoy it too. Hopefully at no expense to
Yeah.
the quality of the food. So that's always a question, I guess.
And one of the hurdles we're facing now in that natural category or front is going back to the use of phosphates for cat palatant. A lot of those are not quote unquote natural. They're chemically synthesized. So
Yeah.
we're trying to figure out different options there because it's just hard to in a two-bowl test compare or compete a phosphate versus a non-phosphate cat
Yeah.
palatant.
Yeah, I understand that. So that's yeah, it's sort of like so much part of nutrition. It's providing that benefit to the pet and also meeting the desired pet parents attributes of the food, and both legitimate and good. We're in the process of trying to meet that. So it's
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. What do you think? What if you look out over the future? I mean, is there something on the horizon that interests you? You talked a little bit about meeting the new ingredient desires. Are there others? What do you think?
There's been a lot of emphasis on plant-based palatants
Okay.
and trying to make those design those so that they smell like meat to a dog and a cat. And it's not just because there's a lot of vegan or vegetarian diets out there, but when you make a plant-based palatant, it becomes very compatible across a wide range of diets. And it also makes it very easy for customers who do a lot of exporting because you get into a lot of export restrictions when you deal with certain animal proteins. When
Yeah.
it's a plant-based product, you don't have to deal with a lot of that permit and paperwork, and it can be also applied very across a wide range of formulas. For example, limited ingredient diets.
Hmm.
That's where there's just one protein and often one carbohydrate source. So if you have a full line of LID formulas, a beef, a chicken, a salmon, and a duck, you can use one palatant for all of those rather than just have to carry four different palatants. And that matters to pet food
Just to know
manufacturers.
though, the LID is a limited ingredient. What is LID?
Limited ingredient diet. So you'll see
Of
those
course.
advertised where they only have a handful of ingredients in the
Sure.
whole bag. And it's usually just one protein. So, for example, chicken and sweet potato. And
Right.
sweet potato would be the carbohydrate. And then it's just
Yeah.
vitamins and minerals and natural flavor and maybe a few other things. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So would you then need to have a sweet potato base palatant?
well, no, you just would need a plant based because what
Plant
you
based.
can't
Okay.
do in that case is have a pork based palatant go
Okay.
on a chicken and sweet potato because now you got two animal proteins in there.
Yeah. So you're trying to limit, yeah, one animal protein.
And to a pet food producer, you don't have to carry so many palatants. They're always limited on space, bin space, and it's just very nice if you can get a good palatant to go over several different formulas rather than have a specific palatant for every specific formula.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you have trouble if you're bringing those plant-based? I tend to think these, I think of a cat as an obligate carnivore and a dog as an omnivore. They both like meat, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
So is that a pretty big hurdle to bring in a plant-based
Yeah.
palatant?
It is definitely more of a hurdle for cats. As you said, they are carnivores and it can, you can do it. It's just hard. Again, going back to the different types of tests, it's easy to get a cat to accept, fairly easy to get a cat to accept a plant based palatant with phosphates. But it's not so easy to beat a super premium meat based palatant on that same kind of kibble. So again, it goes back to what your expectations are. Are you trying to be better than your competitor, or do you just want to have the cat accept the food? So
Yeah.
that's what the decision often comes down to.
Well, you work for an international company, and you talked a lot about that opportunities to make something in one regulatory space and export it to another. Do you think about that a lot with your ingredients? That depending on where they're going to be purchased, this export trade is really important.
Yeah, as far as our palatants, we'll make palatants here in North America. We also have a facility in Italy and one in South America. So there are different regulations within those different regions. But as far as what we make in North America and who we're selling to, that product, those kibbles and treats can go all over the world, and that's where a lot of the regulatory and the restrictions come in, is in that part of the thing business.
Wow. That's fascinating. How long have you been, in this area of trying to design the best tasting palatants? How many years have you spent here?
I've been with Kemin for 6.5 years, and that's when I've been dealing just specifically with palatants and specialty spray dried proteins. We do a lot of different hydrolyzed proteins that are used in a lot of prescription diets. And the hydrolysis process is also used not just for our proteins, but also for all of our palatants. Whatever starting material we're using, whether it's pea protein for a plant based palatant or chicken liver, pork liver, all goes through a hydrolysis process. And so that's what I've been. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, people might not understand that, and I think it's
Sure.
a sort of interesting factor you've spoken of. So, hydrolysis is you're using enzymes to break up the protein. Does
Right.
that just always make it more tasty, or do you make it in a way that makes it a better tasting product?
Well, what it does is it helps when you break that protein down into amino acids and peptides, it makes them able to react better with going back to that Maillard reaction that I
So
was
it's
talking about.
sort of
So
frees them
now
up for those taste reactions.
for those
Yeah.
reactions to take place where we're going to add things like sulfur containing amino acids, for example, certain types of B vitamins, not for nutrition, but as cofactors in a lot of these aroma reactions. Just breaking that protein down enables it to interact and facilitate a lot more reactions in a lot more faster pace than if you were to just throw in something that was non-hydrolyzed.
So when you look at your endpoints, it is the one. So you're delivering a nutrient package, but that's sort of defined by doing analysis. Is your single most important, maybe the only important output, is how does it taste? Is
I
that
think so. Yeah, I think so. When it comes to palatants, 99% of the time, it's just how does it taste? How is it
yeah?
going to perform?
And of course, I don't mean the foundation that's built on. I should point out is it's not going to be microbial contaminated. It's not going to there's a safety issue that I just accepted as flat. I mean everybody's
Yeah.
required that, but building off of that then is this: how does it taste?
Yeah, the food safety is very important because, as you know, these palatants are applied after the kill step, usually the last thing that goes on the food. So we have a very, yeah, anybody making palatants is going to have a very strict food safety hold and release program. for their palatants.
Tell us about hold and release. What does that mean? That's an unusual
It's
kind of.
what a pet food, same thing that a pet food manufacturer will do with their finished food. You basically hold it until you can test it for microbial contamination. Once it's declared okay, then it's able to leave your facility and go out into the marketplace.
Yeah, actually, that's something that interests, I think, in general, people don't necessarily know about quality pet food manufacturers, that you have the process that assures you you're making a quality product, but then that's tested at the end too, so
Mm-hmm.
that you actually know what happened. It's sort of both required. You can't necessarily test in quality, but just assuring quality through process is also not sufficient. So
Right.
it's interesting that you, as an ingredient supplier, sort of talk of the same space.
Oh yeah, as you know, salmonella contamination is first and foremost in the pet food industry, and so every pet food manufacturer pretty much requires a salmonella-free certificate on any ingredient that's coming into their plant that's going to be applied after that kill step.
Yeah, everybody worries about it. It's a
Hmm.
problem in human food too. So it's food manufacturer. One thing that we talked a little bit before we got on the air, and I think there's an important part of this that just touch on. Of course, this is a process where a lot of value is added, but the actual starting ingredients in liver and viscera that you might be using, these are often not really used in human consumption. They're sort of
Right.
a secondary product of that stream, and so in some ways you're delivering a high quality, starting not with a low quality ingredient, but in some ways a secondary ingredient in a primary ingredient stream.
And that's how those materials came to be so commonly used, is because historically they weren't going into human food, yet they're very nutritious, very
Yeah,
flavorful, especially to a dog and a cat, and again lend themselves very well to the hydrolysis process.
yeah, interesting. Sort of not exactly lemonade out of lemons, but kind of that idea.
And as we know, liver is very nutritious, so you have that component too.
Yeah. Yes, I understand. One thing I always ask people, and you've been in a couple of different spaces, and you've walked through this. What do you find? You look at someone who maybe you'd like to recruit for your team, or look for someone who you think would be a success in your area. What attributes would an individual? Maybe they're a student that's listening to this
Sure.
episode. What would they say? If I could develop this, I would have a benefit for my job if, for example, you were that hiring manager or person
I
in
mean, I
charge.
would just any other as with any scientific position, you want to look for somebody that has that curiosity, that has
Fascinating.
knowledge of the scientific method and how to test things, and just because a lot of times in palatants you don't know, you just kind of trying things to see what work. You might have an idea that this would mix well, this ingredient with the other, but I would say just look for somebody with that drive and that curiosity to and not be afraid to fail.
Oh, those are often mentioned. I want to dive a little deeper on the afraid to fail. We don't like to fail, right? And yet
Right.
sometimes that recognizing failure when it slaps us and not taking too much of a hit is part of success.
You got to know what doesn't work is just as important as knowing what does work. It's We've heard that saying before, and it sticks with me. Just because something didn't work doesn't mean it was a failure. I mean, now we know what not to try next time.
Yeah,
Everything's a
fascinating.
building block.
Well, that's kind of I sort of covered the things I wanted to talk to you about. I wonder if as we look at sort of next steps, if you could say, I would wish for this in the industry, in the pet food science space. Is there a collaboration or an interaction, or what would really make success for the whole industry from your perspective enhanced?
I would say if we could all get together and figure out an alternative to these phosphates for cats, that would be something That seems to be a code nobody's been able to crack yet, at least to a very significant degree. Uh, I mean,
Yeah, good.
that could be one example, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for our time. I've
Yeah,
sure enjoyed learning more about this area of it's exciting how to make a better tasting cake, if you will, or from a
sure.
pet food kibble side, how to make that kibble taste better to the pet. The balance that you've described as far as taking ingredients that perhaps are not very valuable for the human food chain and making them a very valuable component for the pet food space. That's fun. I appreciate it.
Hmm. No problem. It was a pleasure being here.